History is written by the victors, but the truth is hidden in the blood that the rain couldn't wash away. Did you watch The Last Kingdom? And you believe that England was born from the bravery of a man named Uhtred. But I need to tell you, the centerpiece of this puzzle is a lie. The hero you admire is nothing more than an anachronistic ghost, and the king you respect was a man so consumed by grief that his greatest victory occurred while he hid like a rat in a stinking swamp. Prepare to forget everything you think you know about Vikings and Saxons. What you're about to see isn't a medieval fairy tale. It's the investigation of a historical fraud, and the revelation of facts so absurd that Hollywood didn't dare film them. Did you know that Saxon purity was saved by a Viking leader forcibly baptized? Or that the most powerful woman of that era was erased from popular memory simply for being more brilliant than the kings around her? In this video, I'm going to give you the keys to the real Bebbanburgh. We'll explore crucial points where true history puts fiction to shame, revealing a power game where betrayal was the only real currency. If you think you have the stomach to face the reality behind the myth, you're in the right place. By subscribing and liking this video, you join our elite group of explorers of the past, helping to rescue the truth from the shadows and spread knowledge ignored by mainstream media. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching this video from? I want to know how far our troop of historians is reaching. The mists of time often blend the steel of reality with the silk of fiction. For the viewer of The Last Kingdom, Uhtred of Bebbanburgh is the personification of the conflict between two worlds, the Saxon and the Danish. However, when we open the codices of real history, we find a fascinating paradox. The man who rides alongside Alfred the Great in the 9th century is in fact a shadow cast by a nobleman who would only breathe the frigid air of Northumbria more than 100 years later. The historical Uhtred, known as the Bold, was Ealdorman of Bamburgh between 1006 and 1016, fighting Scots and Danes in an era where England was already a much more solid concept than Alfred dared to dream of. This temporal transposition is not a gross error, but a literary tool used by Bernard Cornwell to give a face to the chaos of an era lacking detailed biographical records of individual warriors. The Uhtred of the series carries the DNA of the Bamburgh resistance, a fortress that, for centuries, remained an isolated bastion of Saxon power in a sea of Viking influence. Watching the series, the viewer is not seeing a biography, but rather the personification of a lineage. It is the spirit of a family that refused to fall, represented in a single man who, ironically, is a living anachronism. If this duality between the real man and the legend surprised you, leave a like so we can continue exploring these secrets hidden in the folds of time. Imagine the audacity of an author taking a real ancestor and throwing him into the center of the storm that defined the birth of a nation. Uhtred is, at the same time, nobody and all the warriors who bled for England to exist. He is the hero that history forgot to record, but that fiction made sure to immortalize so that we could understand the weight of divided loyalty. The image that film and television often sell us is that of Nordic warriors covered in mud, soot, and blood, with matted hair and an appearance of utter sloppiness. However, archaeological excavations and contemporary accounts tell a radically different story, bordering on the opposite. By medieval standards, the Vikings were the vainest of Europe, while the Saxons often found themselves bound by Christian austerity or simple hygienic negligence. The Danes were known for their bathing rituals and personal grooming. Among the most common items found in Viking tombs are not only swords and axes, but combs meticulously carved from whalebone or deer antlers, tweezers, ear cleaners, and razor blades. There was even a recurring complaint among English chroniclers of the time that the Danes seduced Saxon women with their excessive cleanliness. They bathed on Saturdays, the Saturday or bath day, and they changed clothes frequently to display their status. Their tunics were vibrant, dyed in expensive colors like blue and red, and adorned with intricate embroidery that indicated their lineage and achievements. The dark leather and rustic furs of the series served to create a visual aesthetic of a villain or rebellious warrior, but the historical truth shines in the reflection of a basin of clean water. When we imagine the invasion of England, we shouldn't just visualize a dirty horde, but rather an army of men who cared for their beards and hair with as much zeal as they cared for the edge of their weapons. Hygiene was not merely aesthetic. It was a demonstration of discipline and superiority over those they considered less civilized. Looking at Alfred's figure in the Chronicles, we are led to believe in a visionary who saw, beyond the horizon of battles, the clear image of a nation unified under one flag and one faith. But historical science invites us to question, was England a planned project or a desperate consequence of survival? At the beginning of the 9th century, there was no concept of being English. You were a West Saxon, a Mercian, an East Anglo-Saxon, or a Northumbrian. The idea of union was born less from a feeling of brotherhood and more from a shared terror. The kingdom of the Angles and Saxons was the title Alfred began to use, not out of a romantic imperialist desire, but because Wessex was the last stronghold. If Wessex fell, Christianity and Saxon culture would be swept from the island. The prophecy of a united kingdom was a brilliant political construct. Alfred used religion to create a common identity against the pagan invaders. He wasn't just defending lands. He was defending the soul of a people he himself helped define through educational reforms and the compilation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. The Project of England was, therefore, the greatest propaganda and resistance campaign of the Middle Ages. One people, one God, one king was the mantra that kept men on the shield wall when death seemed certain. It wasn't a natural process, but a forced birth by Danish axes. Without the external pressure of the Vikings, it is very likely that the kingdoms of the heptarchy would have continued in endless civil wars for centuries more. The common enemy was the cement that bound the bricks of the English nation together. To understand the magnitude of what Uhtred and Alfred faced, we need to turn back the clock to the period known as the heptarchy. The island of Britain was a mosaic of 7 major kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Kent, Sussex, and Essex. Imagine a fragmented territory where the line between peace and war was as thin as a river. Each kingdom had its own royal lineage, its own laws, and a bloody rivalry with its neighbors. Northumbria, in the north, was a center of learning and faith, home to wealthy monasteries like Lindisfarne. Mercia, in the heart of the island, was often the dominant military power. Wessex, in the south, was the kingdom seeking to consolidate its power under the Cerdic dynasty. The year 793 AD changed everything. The Viking raid on Lindisfarne was not just plunder. It was a cultural and spiritual shock that sent shockwaves throughout Christendom. Never before had such terror appeared in Britain, wrote the scholar Alcuin. Before the series begins, the setting is one of extreme vulnerability. The Saxon kingdoms were too busy fighting amongst themselves to realize that the sea was bringing something they could not defeat alone. The initial raids were swift and opportunistic, focused on gold and slaves. However, what the Saxons did not foresee was that the men of the north would no longer merely want the treasures of their monasteries, but would also desire their lands. The stage was set. On one side, proud and divided kingdoms. On the other, an unstoppable force driven by the need for expansion and the promise of Valhalla. Bebbanburgh, modern-day Bamburgh, is not just a setting in the series. It is one of the most historically and symbolically rich locations in northern England. Built on an outcrop of volcanic basalt jutting out into the North Sea, the fortress was considered virtually impregnable. In the 9th century, it was the heart of power in Northumbria. When the series depicts the fall of the fortress to the Danes, it touches on a crucial point in historical reality: the fragility of Saxon capitals in the face of Viking mobility. Northumbria was the first major kingdom to collapse, and the loss of Bebbanburgh meant the decapitation of resistance in the north. Historically, Bebbanburgh's strategic importance lay in its ability to control sea routes and offer a safe haven against land invasions. For the Saxons, losing this castle meant losing their connection to their glorious past and to the sea that had once brought them to that land as conquerors. The fortress changed hands several times, but the lineage of the lords of Bamburgh maintained an almost mystical autonomy, defying kings and invaders for generations. In the narrative, Uhtred's obsession with reclaiming his home reflects the almost religious importance that land ownership held for the nobility of the time. Without his land, a lord was nothing. With Bebbanburgh, he was a king in all but name. The basalt rock upon which the fortress still rests is the silent testament to 1,000 years of sieges, betrayals, and the resilience of a people who refused to be erased from history. The year 865 AD marks a tectonic shift in the history of Great Britain. Until then, Viking raids had been like summer storms, swift, destructive, and fleeting. However, what landed in East Anglia that year was not a band of raiders, but the the Great Heathen Army. Unlike previous expeditions, these men did not come merely to take gold from the altars. They came to stay. The coalition, composed of Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish warriors, brought with it a logistical infrastructure that the Saxon kingdoms, divided by territorial squabbles, were unprepared to handle. The series portrays this moment as the beginning of the end for the Christian kingdoms, and history confirms this gravity. Led by legendary figures claiming vengeance for the death of Ragnar Lothbrok, the Great Army did not move like a disorderly horde, but like a precise war machine. They captured horses to increase their mobility on land and used England's vast river system to penetrate the heart of the kingdoms. The economic impact was devastating. Fields were abandoned, villages burned, and the trade system paralyzed. The army did not merely conquer, it occupied, establishing winter bases and forcing the Saxon kings to pay the infamous Danegeld, the tribute to avert the attack. This was the moment when the survival of Anglo-Saxon culture was put to the test, and the scale of the invasion made it clear that only an unprecedented union could prevent total annihilation. If the Grand Army was the body of the invasion, Ubba and Ivar were the brains and the fist. In the series, Ubba is portrayed as an unstable and superstitious warrior, but historical records suggest a commander of cruel cunning. Ivar, often called the Boneless, a nickname that still intrigues historians, possibly referring to a physical condition or his agility in battle, was the master strategist. They were known for their psychological brutality, using public executions and rituals like the Blood Eagle, whose historical existence is debated, but whose terror it inspired was very real, to break the will of their enemies before they even drew their swords. Ivar and Ubba were responsible for the fall of York and the definitive collapse of Northumbria and East Anglia. The effectiveness of their command stemmed from their ability to adapt Norse tactics to English terrain. They did not fight fairly. They preferred ambushes, attacks on Christian holy days, and the use of swift fortifications. The fear that these names instilled was so great that they became almost supernatural in the chronicles of the time. The death of each of them, Ivar in Dublin or in the mists of history, and Ubba at the Battle of Sinwit, represented a sigh of relief for Christendom, but the trail of destruction they left paved the way for the new Norse order that would establish itself in the north and east of the island. The fall of East Anglia in 869 AD provided history with one of its darkest and most enduring tales, the death of King Edmund. The last kingdom, we see the brutality of the Danes, but the true story of Edmund elevates the conflict to a spiritual dimension. According to hagiographic tradition, Edmund refused to rule as a pagan vassal and renounce his Christian faith. In response, the Vikings tied him to a tree, whipped him, and used him as target practice until he resembled a hedgehog, before finally beheading him. This event was not merely a military defeat, it was the necessary fuel for Saxon resistance. Edmund's death transformed a war of territory into a war of religion. He was quickly canonized, and his tomb in Bury St. Edmunds became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in Europe. For Alfred and the Saxons of Wessex, Edmund's sacrifice was proof that the Vikings were not merely political enemies, but demonic forces seeking to extinguish the light of Christ on earth. This us versus them sentiment, solidified by Edmund's martyrdom, gave the Saxons the moral fiber to endure the decades of conflict that followed, proving that sometimes a dead king can be more dangerous to his enemies than a living one. Alfred was not born to be king. As the fourth son of Aethelwulf, his chances of ascending the throne of Wessex were slim. He was a young intellectual in a world that valued brute force, a man who suffered from excruciating abdominal pains and periods of extreme weakness that modern medicine speculates to be Crohn's disease. However, the successive deaths of his three older brothers, all in battle or from illness, placed the crown upon his head at the darkest moment in Saxon history. What makes Alfred the Great in history and in the series is not his skill with the axe, but his mind. He understood that physical strength had limits, and that survival depended on logistics, education, and faith. In his moments of introspection, Alfred often saw himself as a sinner being punished by God through the Viking invasion, which led him to an obsessive search for righteousness. "I wished to live worthily while I lived," he later wrote, "and after my death, to leave to the men who would come after me a remembrance of me in good works." This reluctant king, who preferred books to battles, ended up becoming the architect of a defensive system that would change the face of Western Europe. Imagine yourself in Wessex at the end of the 9th century. The air smells of smoke and fear. All the other Saxon kingdoms have fallen. Mercia is a Danish puppet state, Northumbria is lost, and East Anglia is a graveyard of kings. Wessex is all that remains. Life here was a constant preparation for siege. Farms were fortified, and every free man was obliged to serve in the siege, fire the peasant army. But Wessex was also a place of fervent hope. Under Alfred, the kingdom became a haven for scholars and priests fleeing the destruction in the north, bringing with them books and knowledge that the king longed to preserve. It is here, at this critical moment in our history, that I want to pause to invite you to be part of our own resistance force. If you are enjoying delving into the truth behind the swords and shield walls, subscribe to the channel and like this video. By doing so, you not only help spread quality historical knowledge, but also ensure that more people know the difference between myth and reality. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below with your city. And if there is any other historical period or series you would like to see dissected here, leave your suggestion. Your participation is what keeps this channel alive, just as the resilience of the Saxons kept Wessex standing. If Alfred personified order and Christian faith, Guthram was Norse chaos and determination. In real history, Guthram was not just a band leader. He was a warrior king who understood that to dominate England, it was necessary to destroy the heart of Wessex. The rivalry between him and Alfred, portrayed in the series with such tension, reflects a clash of civilizations. Guthram represented a new generation of Viking leaders who sought not only fleeting plunder, but ultimate territorial sovereignty. He was cunning enough to break oaths made on sacred rings when the tactical advantage presented itself, something that horrified Alfred's Christian sense of honor. Guthram's true threat lay in his patience. He sought not merely a pitched battle, but the systematic attrition of Wessex's defenses. In 878 AD, he delivered what should have been the coup de grace, a surprise attack in the middle of winter during the Epiphany celebrations in Chippenham. This unconventional act of warfare forced the Saxon king to flee into the shadows, leaving the kingdom at the mercy of the Danes. Guthram came closer than any other Viking leader to erasing Serdic's lineage and, by extension, Saxon identity. His ambition was not just gold, but the crown of a kingdom he believed was destined to fall under the weight of Norse axes. The image of Alfred the Great hiding in the marshes of Aethelflaed, Somerset, is one of the founding pillars of English national myth. The series captures the atmosphere of despair, but the historical reality is even more stark. Reduced to a small group of loyal followers, the King of Wessex became a guerrilla fighter in his own land. Aethelflaed was an island surrounded by impassable marshes, a refuge where the king was forced to live by hunting and small supply raids. It is from this period that the famous legend, without historical proof but immensely popular, arises of Alfred letting a peasant woman's cakes burn because he was too distracted by war plans. Although the cake episode is folklore, Alfred's suffering was real. He was sick, hungry, and surrounded by enemies. However, it was in the isolation of Aethelflaed that the king demonstrated his true greatness. Instead of surrendering, he set up a network of espionage and communication, sending messengers through the forests to summon men from Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. Aethelflaed was not just a hideout, it was the command center of an underground resistance. The fact that Alfred managed to assemble an army from nothing, while the world believed him dead or in exile, is one of the most impressive logistical feats of the Middle Ages. In May of 878 AD, the fate of England was decided on a hill in Edington, Edington. Alfred emerged from the marshes with a force that surprised Guthram. The series portrays the shield wall with visceral brutality, and historical accounts confirm that it was a fight of utter exhaustion. The Saxons, driven by religious fervor and the desperation of those who have nothing left to lose, held their formation against the Danish onslaught for hours. The clash of wood against wood and iron against flesh lasted until Guthram's lines finally gave way. This was not just another battle, it was the victory that proved the Vikings were not invincible. If Alfred had lost at Edington, there would be no England, no English language as we know it, and the island would have become a cultural extension of Scandinavia. After the victory, Alfred pursued the Danes to their stronghold and besieged them for 2 weeks until famine forced them to surrender. The victory at Edington was the climax of Wessex's first major crisis, and the moment when Alfred ceased to be just a fleeing king and became the savior of his people. If this turning point in history fascinates you, don't forget to leave your like, because we are entering the phase where diplomacy becomes as sharp as the sword. Guthram's surrender led to one of the most curious and strategically brilliant events in history, his baptism. Instead of executing the Viking leader, Alfred demanded that he become a Christian, with the Saxon king himself serving as his godfather. In the series, we see the tension of this forced conversion, but in real politics, it was a masterstroke. By transforming Guthram into his spiritual son, Alfred imposed a bond of loyalty that went beyond political treaties. He inserted the Viking leader into the Christian moral order, facilitating coexistence. The Treaty of Wedmore, which followed, laid the groundwork for peace. Guthram withdrew to East Anglia, where he ruled as a Christian king, respecting the borders of Wessex. Alfred knew he could not expel all the Danes from the island, so he chose to integrate them under terms that guaranteed the security of his own kingdom. Baptism was not an act of religious charity, but an instrument of lasting pacification. It was the recognition that the sword may win a battle, but only culture and religion can maintain a stable peace in a divided land. The direct consequence of the conflicts between Alfred and Guthram was the creation of the Danelaw, the land of Danish law. This was a vast area in northern and eastern England where Norse laws, customs, and language prevailed. The series portrays this division as a constant source of conflict, and historically, that's exactly what it was. The dividing line, which ran roughly from London to Chester, separated two distinct worlds that needed to learn to negotiate with each other. The Danelaw left indelible marks that last to this day, especially in the names of towns ending in by, like Derby or Thorpe. Economically, the Danelaw became a vibrant region, with cities like York, Jorvik, transforming into major centers of international trade, connecting England to the rest of the Viking world, from the Arctic to Byzantium. For Alfred, the Danelaw was a necessary evil. For future kings of England, it would be the territory to be reconquered to realize the dream of a unified nation. The existence of the Danelaw is proof that the history of England is not only Saxon, but a hybrid forged in the encounter of two fiercely independent peoples. After the truce with the Danes, Alfred understood that he could not rely solely on miracles or makeshift shield walls. He initiated one of the greatest military engineering projects of the Middle Ages, the burghs system. Burghs was an administrative document detailing the creation of a network of fortified cities scattered throughout Wessex. The strategy was brilliant. No point in the kingdom should be more than a day's walk, about 30 kilometers, from a safe haven. In the series, we see these constructions as a backdrop, but historically they were the foundation of English urban planning. These burghs, which gave rise to the suffix burrier borough in cities like Canterbury and Oxford, the fortified towns were not just strongholds, they were economic centers. Alfred encouraged trade and settlement within these walls, ensuring that in case of attack, the population and supplies were protected, leaving the Vikings with nothing to plunder. This system of defense in depth was a game-changer. The Great Heathen Army, masters of swift attacks, now faced a static and organized resistance that could not be ignored. Wessex's economy flourished under this security, transforming the kingdom into the richest and most stable on the island. The relationship between Wessex and Mercia is one of the most sensitive political issues of the last kingdom in historical reality. Mercia was a proud kingdom that had dominated England for centuries before the rise of Wessex. However, crushed by Norse invasions, The remaining free western half of Mercia needed to seek protection. Aethelred, Lord of the Mercians, accepted Alfred's suzerainty, a move that was less a matter of friendship and more a calculation of political survival. Aethelred was not merely the ailing warrior depicted in the series. He was a capable leader who understood that the future of his people depended on an alliance with the Wessex dynasty. He relinquished the title of king to assume that of ealdorman or lord, recognizing Alfred as the supreme leader of the Anglo-Saxons. This union was sealed not only with words, but with the blood of one of the most important women in British history, Aethelflaed. The integration of Mercia was the first concrete step towards the creation of a unified England, permanently shifting the axis of power southward. If there is a character in the Last Kingdom whose grandeur on screen is but a pale reflection of her historical importance, this is Aethelflaed. Eldest daughter of Alfred and wife of Aethelred, she was not merely a queen consort. When her husband fell ill and died, Aethelflaed assumed the rule of Mercia in her own right, an extraordinary feat for a woman in the 10th century. She was a born military strategist, leading armies, building fortresses, and reconquering territories from the Danes with an efficiency that astonished her contemporaries. Aethelflaed was not only Uhtred's lover in fiction. In history, she was the tactical partner of her brother, King Edward. Together, they executed a pincer movement against the Vikings of the Danelaw. While Edward attacked from the south, Aethelflaed advanced from the north, fortifying cities like Chester and recapturing Derby and Leicester. She was so respected that chroniclers of the time referred to her with almost royal titles. Without her determination to maintain the autonomy of Mercia allied with Wessex, Alfred's project would have died with him. She is the ultimate example that, in the founding of England, intellect and courage knew no gender. In the series, figures like Father Beocca and Father Peerlig are the moral advisors to Uhtred and Alfred. But the Church's role in real history was even more profound. The clergy held a monopoly on writing. The reason we know so much about Alfred and so little about the victories of many Viking leaders is that Saxon monks controlled the narrative. The Church provided the bureaucratic structure necessary to govern a kingdom, keeping records of taxes, laws, and, crucially, the Anglo-Saxon chronicle. Religion was the social glue. Alfred promoted an educational renaissance, insisting that all young nobles learn to read in Old English, not just Latin. He wanted his people to understand both the laws and the faith. The Church also served as a propaganda tool. Victories were presented as divine blessings and defeats as punishments for sins. Figures like Beocca represent this fusion between faith and state. They were diplomats, treasurers, and historians. Christianity was used to civilize the Vikings, transforming Norse warriors into Christian neighbors through baptism, which was far more effective than trying to kill every invader. The character Skad, with her curses and bloody visions, introduces the mystical element into the series. But where does poetic license end and historical record begin? Although there is no evidence of a specific seer named Skad who cursed a Saxon hero, the belief in magic and destiny, Virdit, was omnipresent on both sides. The Vikings carried seers, known as vulvas, on their expeditions. They practiced the cider, a form of magic that was believed to be able to weave destiny and predict the outcome of battles. On the Saxon side, despite official Christianity, the population still maintained deep roots in Germanic pagan folklore. The use of amulets, the interpretation of natural omens, and the fear of curses were integral parts of daily life. The series uses Skade to dramatize the cultural clash, the rigidity of Christian law against the wild and fatalistic freedom of Norse paganism. Historically, this transition was slow and full of syncretism. The Vikings did not abandon their gods overnight. Many simply added Jesus Christ to their pantheon of gods, ensuring they were protected on all sides. This climate of spiritual tension added a layer of constant psychological fear to the physical warfare. Alfred's death in 899 AD sent shockwaves throughout the island. The man who had held up the shield wall for nearly 3 decades left behind a stabilized kingdom, but an unfinished dream. In the series, we see Edward as an often hesitant young man, living under the colossal shadow of his father. Historically, Edward the Elder was a pragmatic king and a formidable warrior. He inherited not only a throne, He inherited the responsibility of proving that the idea of England could outlive its creator. The succession was not peaceful. Edward's right was immediately contested, revealing that hereditary monarchy was still a fragile concept and depended on the approval of the monarchy. Eastern, the Council of Nobles. Edward needed to act quickly to consolidate his power in Wessex before the Danelaw Danes perceived Alfred's death as an opportunity for a new all-out invasion. His strategy was to continue the burgh expansion, transforming the kingdom into an administrative stronghold. If Alfred was the architect, Edward was the master builder, who began to erect the walls of the national building upon the foundation laid by his father. Aethelflaed is one of the most fascinating antagonists in the last kingdom, Aethelflaed, and his story is based on real events of dynastic betrayal. Son of King Aethelred I, Alfred's older brother, Aethelflaed believed the throne of Wessex was his by right of primogeniture, claiming that his uncle Alfred had been a usurper. In 901 AD, he led a revolt that historians call Aethelflaed's Rebellion. Realizing he lacked sufficient support in Wessex, he did the unthinkable. He fled to Northumbria and allied himself with the Danes, who acclaimed him as king. This was a moment of profound crisis. A Saxon prince leading a Viking army against his own people was Alfred's worst nightmare come true. Aethelflaed brought a dangerous legitimacy to the Norse cause. The rebellion only ended at the Battle of Home in 902 AD. Although the Danes technically won the battle on the field, Aethelflaed was killed in the confrontation. With his death, Alfred's lineage was free of immediate internal claimants, but the scar of betrayal served to remind Edward that royal blood was no guarantee of loyalty. One of the most interesting military episodes of the period was the occupation and fortification of Chester by Aethelflaed in 907 AD. Chester was an ancient Roman city in ruins, but its walls still held monumental strategic importance, guarding the borders with Wales and the Irish Sea. The series depicts the conflict within these ruins, but the historical fact highlights the logistical intelligence of the Saxons. They not only reoccupied the city, they transformed it into a command center to neutralize the Vikings coming from Dublin. Legend has it, and some records suggest, that during the siege of Chester by the Vikings and Welsh, the Mercians under Aethelflaed used creative tactics, such as throwing beehives at the attackers and pouring warm beer, for lack of oil, to repel shield walls. Beyond folklore, the recapture of Chester marked the beginning of Wessex and Mercia's systematic offensive against the Danelaw. It was the moment when the Saxons ceased merely defending their borders and began to engulf enemy territory through strategic fortification. While Edward and Aethelflaed consolidated the south and center, new threats emerged in the Irish Sea. The Connaught of the series represents the Norse Gaelic leaders who began to pressure Northumbria and northwestern Mercia. These Vikings were different from Guthram's Danes. They were veterans of the wars in Ireland, bringing more aggressive tactics and a political vision that sought to unite Dublin with Jorvik. This period was marked by a complex politics of alliances and betrayals. The Danes, who had lived in the Danelaw for generations, began to see themselves as natives and at times feared these new invaders as much as the Saxons had. Connaught symbolizes this disruptive force that compelled Edward to maintain a standing army. The pressure from these new Viking leaders prevented Edward from a swift conquest of the north, transforming the unification of England into a war of attrition that would last for decades. Young Aethelstan, whom we see grow up under Uhtred's tutelage in the fiction, is perhaps the most important figure in all of Anglo-Saxon history after Alfred. Edward, his father, made an unusual political decision. He sent Aethelstan to be raised at the court of his aunt, Aethelflaed, in Mercia. This was not abandonment, but a stroke of diplomatic genius. By being raised among the Mercians, Aethelstan became the heir that both kingdoms, Wessex and Mercia, could accept. Historically, Aethelstan was educated as both a warrior and a scholar. He learned to govern on an active frontier, seeing firsthand how his aunt administered war and justice. This two-pronged upbringing is what allowed him, years later, to become the first man to be truly called King of all England. In the series, his relationship with Uhtred represents this practical learning of war, but in reality, his training was a meticulous preparation to fulfill the destiny that his grandfather, Alfred, only glimpsed through the mists of illness and war. We now move on to the period when the tide of war definitively turns in favor of the Saxons, culminating in battles that decimated the Norse leadership and prepared the ground for the final unification of the island. The year 910 AD witnessed one of the most significant massacres of the Viking Age on English soil. The Battle of Tettenhall, also known as the Battle of Wensfield, was the moment when the combined forces of Wessex and Mercia inflicted a catastrophic defeat on the Danes of Northumbria. In the series, we see this battle as a chaos of steel and mud, but historically, its impact was political and dynastic. 3 Viking kings were killed in a single day. Edward and Aethelflaed demonstrated unprecedented military coordination. While the Norse army was returning from a raid in Mercia, laden with spoils, it was intercepted by Saxon forces. The loss of an entire generation of Danish leaders at Tettenhall created a power vacuum in the north that was never fully filled. Without kings to lead them, the Viking settlements of the Danelaw became vulnerable, allowing the Saxon reconquest to advance more aggressively. Tettenhall was, essentially, the breaking point of Norse dominance in the south and center of the island. With the weakening of the local Danes, a new lineage of leaders emerged. The Norse Gaelic leaders from Dublin. Sigtryggr, known as Sigtrygg Ivarsson, is a fascinating historical figure who appears in the series as a pragmatic and visionary leader. He represents the Kingdom of York, Jorvik, which functioned almost like an independent state in the north. Sigtryggr was not merely an invader. He was an administrator seeking to consolidate a commercial empire that would unite the British Isles with Scandinavia. Sigtryggr's relationship with the Saxons was marked by cautious diplomacy. He married one of Edward the Elder's daughters, an alliance aimed at stabilizing the border between the Christian Saxon world and the pagan north. This cultural mix in York, where coins were minted with Christian symbols and Thor's hammer, shows that victory in England would not be the expulsion of the Vikings, but their assimilation. Sigtryggr symbolizes the last great effort of a Norse leader to maintain York's sovereignty before total unification. The death of Aethelflaed in 918 AD triggered a political crisis that the series portrays with great drama. Historically, the Mercian nobles wanted Aethelflaed's daughter, Aelfwine, to assume power while maintaining the kingdom's autonomy. However, King Edward of Wessex acted with ruthless strategic coldness. He did not allow Mercia to continue as a separate entity. He marched with his army, removed his niece from power, and annexed Mercia directly to the Wessex crown. This was a moment of forced union. Although the Mercians and West Saxons were allies, the absorption of Mercia was seen by many as an occupation. Edward knew that, to definitively defeat the Vikings, England could not be a confederation of kingdoms, but a single power block under a single command. The removal of Aelfwine marked the end of Mercian autonomy and the administrative birth of the Kingdom of England, although the official title would still take a few years to be consolidated by Aethelstan. Breda in the Last Kingdom. Breda embodies the fury and resentment of those who refuse to accept the new Christian and Saxon order. Although Breda is a fictional creation, she represents a real historical sentiment, the resistance of pagan communities who saw their culture being systematically erased. Norse paganism did not die in a single battle. It was gradually stifled by laws that prohibited ancient rituals and by the economic pressure to convert in order to participate in Saxon trade. This resistance was fueled by the memory of Ragnar and Ivar's glories. In the rural areas of the Danelaw and the far north, old beliefs persisted for generations, hidden beneath a veneer of Christianity. The figure of the pagan warrior woman who refuses to bend the knee is an archetype reflecting the spiritual tension of the time. For many Norse, conversion was seen as a betrayal of their ancestors, and spiritual conflicts were as bloody as territorial ones. The series uses Breda to give voice to this world that was disappearing into the abyss of history. Bebbanburg, Bamburgh, remained a strategic enigma throughout the unification process. While the south was being reorganized, the deep north, ruled by the lords of Bamburgh, maintained a fierce independence. Fortifications were improved with engineering that blended Saxon knowledge and Norse influences. Historically, the rulers of Bamburgh acted as buffers between the growing Kingdom of England and the Scottish and Norse kingdoms to the north. The fortress was never just a castle, it was a declaration of sovereignty. Its basalt walls were designed to withstand prolonged sieges, and its location allowed control of supplies arriving by sea. In Uhtred's narrative, the recapture of Bamburgh is a personal journey, but historically, it represents the final piece of the puzzle. Whoever controlled Bamburgh controlled access to the heart of Northumbria, and consequently, the stability of the entire northern border of what would become England. We now enter the final stretch of this epic, where the threads of history intertwine to form the fabric of a nation, and where the blood spilled on forgotten fields gave rise to the map we know today. While the Saxons and Danes fought for control of England, to the north, a new power was consolidating. Constantine II, Constantine mac Aeda, King of Alba, Scotland, was one of the most astute players of the 10th century. From the series and the film, Seven Kings Must Die, we see Constantine as a formidable adversary who fears the expansion of Wessex. Historically, he understood that a unified England under Aethelflaed represented an existential threat to Scottish sovereignty. Constantine was not just a warrior, he was a diplomat who knew how to play the pieces on the Norse chessboard. He formed unlikely alliances with Viking leaders from Dublin and with the Britons of Strathclyde to contain the Saxon advance. This multinational coalition was the first great northern alliance against Wessex hegemony. Constantine's role is crucial to understanding that the formation of England affected not only the Saxons and Vikings, but forced all the peoples of the British Isles to position themselves in the face of the rise of a superpower in the south. Often called the greatest battle before Hastings, Brunanburh, 937 AD, is the definitive climax of the Alfred era. Aethelstan, the Saxon king, faced the coalition of Constantine, Olaf Guthfrithson, king of Dublin, and Owain of Strathclyde. Although the exact location of Brunanburh is still debated by archaeologists, its historical impact is undeniable. It was a massacre of epic proportions that lasted from dawn to sunset. Aethelstan's victory at Brunanburh consolidated his title of King of the English. King of the English. In the series, this event is portrayed as the fulfillment of Alfred's prophecy. Historically, it was the moment when the idea of a unified England ceased to be a dream and became a geopolitical reality. The death of several Nordic and Celtic kings and earls on the battlefield ensured that, for a generation, no one dared to challenge the supremacy of Wessex. It was there that England was truly born in fire and blood. To the observer, the conflict appears to be solely about land, but there was a profound clash of jurisprudence. The Saxons, influenced by Roman law and the Church, were building written law codes, such as those of Alfred and Aethelstan, that sought order and systematic punishment. For the Saxons, law came from God and the king. For the Vikings, however, honor and loyalty were governed by oral traditions and the concept of thing assemblies of free men. Although there was no Viking written code in the same way that the Saxons had, the relationship between lord and vassal, then Orerlit, was based on extreme reciprocity. The lord gave rings and gold, and the warrior gave his life. The blood oath was not just a metaphor, it was what held Norse society together. The series explores this through Uhtred, a man caught between the legal duty of a Saxon oath and the visceral loyalty of a Norse warrior. This duality helps to understand why peace was so difficult to achieve. Both sides spoke different languages of honor. Bebbanburg remains the ultimate symbol of resistance. Beyond the fiction of Uhtred, the fortress holds secrets that archaeology is still trying to unravel. Local legends speak of secret tunnels that connected the rock to the sea, allowing the fortress to be resupplied during sieges that lasted for months. Although no definitive evidence of secret passages worthy of a film has ever been found, excavations have revealed sophisticated engineering of cisterns and granaries that made the fortress self-sufficient. The fascination with Bamburgh lies in its continuity. It was never completely abandoned. Unlike many Roman capitals or Saxon cities that fell into ruin, Bamburgh remained a royal residence and a military outpost for over a millennium. In the history of the last kingdom, the fortress represents a safe harbor, but in the history of England, it represents the north that was never fully tamed. It is the anchor that prevented the Saxon identity from being completely erased in the mists of Viking-dominated Northumbria. After battles, sieges, and treaties, The Britain that emerged at the end of the 10th century was unrecognizable compared to the mosaic of kingdoms of its early history. The political landscape stabilized into a monarchy centralized in the figure of the King of England, but with a deep Viking heritage. Economically, the island was more connected than ever. Nordic trade routes brought silks from the east and furs from the north, while Saxon towns guaranteed secure markets for local produce. The final scenario is not merely one of Saxon victory, but of a new synthesis. The Danes were not expelled. They became farmers, merchants, and eventually subjects of the English crown. The English language was enriched by Norse terms, and the political structure of England, with its counties, shires, and justice systems, began to take the form that would endure for centuries. The era of Alfred and Uhtred ended with the founding of a state that would survive until the next great rupture in 1066. The journey of resistance transformed a collection of warring tribes into the foundation of one of the most influential nations in world history.